outdoors, and even if you've got plenty of daylight to work with, it's a good idea to bring along your flash because you can use it to pop in some extra light where it might be needed. And one very common situation where this comes into play is when the ambient light in the background is much brighter than the ambient light in your subject's face. Now in a situation like that, you could just change the exposure settings in your camera to make sure that your subject comes out okay. But what that means is you're also going to increase the brightness of the background ambient light, and that's something that we don't always want to do. But using flash as a fill light is going to help you brighten up the subject without changing the brightness of the background. If you do it right, you can keep everything looking natural, and we're going to talk about doing this with on-camera flash. And yeah, I know it's great to separate your flash from your camera for more sophisticated looks, but sometimes that's just not going to be practical. So before we get to all of that, let me just say that sometimes there's every reason not to use a flash. I mean, even in a kind of worst case scenario where your subject is facing the glaring sunlight, which is not usually a good idea because she's probably going to squint, just have her put on a pair of sunglasses and you're good to go. You can also soften the harsh light with a simple translucent cloth or a scrim like we did here. Turn your subject around and sunlight becomes a nice backlight or a hair light. In this case, the ambient light on the subject's face was pretty good. If it hadn't been, we'd want to find a way to add more light, which is something we can do with fill flash. Another way to avoid using flash is to just find a place with lots of ambient light where your subject is completely shielded from the direct sunlight. Now this shot was taken on a shady side of a street with reflected sunlight coming in off the buildings on the opposite side. So my advice, leave the flash in your bag until you need it. But when you do need it, here are some easy ways to make it work for you. With fill flash, we're essentially trying to turn shots that would otherwise look like this into shots that look more like this. To get started, all you need is your DSLR and a dedicated flash capable of automatic flash metering and output control. On Canon flashes, this is called eTTL, and on Nikon flashes, you'll see TTL on the flash when you're in this mode. With TTL flash control, your camera and flash work together to try to maintain a good flash exposure. Now when shooting outdoors, it's also a good idea to enable high-speed sync on your flash, and that's going to allow your flash and camera to work together when shooting at faster shutter speeds. If you're new to all this, you might want to start off by setting your camera's shooting mode to P, which is the automatic program mode that does a lot of the thinking for you. Now, the upside to doing this is that your camera and flash are going to work together to get some pretty good fill lighting results. The downside, P mode doesn't give you much control over the aperture and shutter speed settings because the camera is pretty much determining those for you. Fortunately, there are a couple of controls you can use to quickly and easily override some of the camera's decisions. Take, for example, flash exposure compensation. Now, this sequence of images shows how adjusting the flash exposure compensation dial allows me to change the output of the flash. Now, notice that the background ambient exposure always stays the same, while the flash exposure is increasing with every shot. Now, another control you can use is exposure compensation, and we're going to talk more about that in another tutorial. But basically, it's going to allow you to lower or raise the ambient exposure in a scene as opposed to lowering or raising the flash exposure. All right, so program mode is almost completely automatic, and it does a pretty good job. But with portraiture, you often want to have more control over your aperture setting, so you can create that nice blurry background that makes your subject stand out. And for this kind of control, you're better off using Aperture Priority as your shooting mode. With your flash set to TTL and high-speed sync, you'll be able to use wide apertures to accomplish shots like this. What Aperture Priority mode does is let you choose an aperture while the camera selects the correct shutter speed to maintain the ambient exposure. So with your flash set to TTL, the flash exposure is going to take care of itself. Just be careful to watch your shutter speed. While you're controlling the aperture, the camera is shifting the shutter speed up and down as it reacts to the ambient lighting. If the shutter speed drops too low, the flash exposure will still be on target, but you could end up with blur and ghosting in your images like this. Finally, I want to mention a couple of tips that might help you when using flash outdoors. When your flash is hitting your subject directly from the camera position, you might notice these specular catch lights, these dots right in the center of the eyes. It's a very unnatural placement for catch lights in my opinion, but using a good sized bounce card like I'm doing here can alter the position of the catch lights just enough to make it look less dead center. Another tip, if you have a light colored wall handy and your flash head has a swivel feature, you can use the wall to bounce bigger, softer light onto your subject like we did here. So to wrap things up, here's what you can do for most outdoor on-camera flash photography. Set your flash mode to TTL, enable the flash's high-speed sync, use Aperture Priority as your shooting mode, and use a wide aperture that's good for portraits, something like f2.8 or f4. Set your ISO to a low setting, but not so low that it forces you into a shutter speed that is too slow if you want to avoid ambient light ghosting. And if you need to dial in more or less flash, just ride your flash exposure compensation dial up or down until you get the amount of flash that works for you. And remember, you can use flash exposure compensation even if you're using P mode instead of Aperture Priority. This should help you get on the fast track to using fill flash. Now, if you want to learn all about using flash, grab a copy of my ebook, 100% Reliable Flash Photography. Okay, we'll see you next time.